I didn't lose my job the day I got my diagnosis. I lost it slowly. One access badge, one calendar invite, one "we'll circle back" at a time. And the worst part is that for the first few weeks, I honestly thought I was being paranoid. I'm a man in my mid-30s, solid role, mid-level management in a tech-adjacent company that loved to brag about people first and mental health matters in every all-hands meeting. I wasn't a star, but I wasn't invisible either. Good reviews, no warnings, no performance plans. I'd been there long enough to know how the system worked, and more importantly, how it usually treated people like me. Then I got sick. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It started with fatigue that didn't go away. Then tests. Then more tests. Then a doctor sitting across from me, choosing his words carefully. It wasn't terminal. It wasn't something that would kill me next month, but it was something that required treatment, regular appointments, and honesty with my employer. I told HR because that's what you're supposed to do. I disclosed the diagnosis, provided medical documentation, and asked for minor accommodations, flexibility on a few mornings, remote days during treatment weeks. Nothing extreme, nothing that hadn't been granted to others before. They nodded. They thanked me for being transparent. They said all the right things. And for about 10 days, everything was normal. Then my calendar started changing. Recurring meetings I'd led for over a year were suddenly optional. Strategy calls I was always on, removed. A project I'd built from scratch was reassigned temporarily while I focused on my health. My manager told me not to worry, that this was just to take pressure off. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But then one morning, my VPN access didn't work. I assumed it was a glitch. It happens. I messaged support. No response. 30 minutes later, my manager slacked me. Hey, quick heads up. It's auditing permissions company-wide. Might be some hiccups. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Because later that same day, I found out a junior colleague had been given access to files I could no longer open. Files that were still technically under my responsibility. When I asked about it, I was told, "We're just streamlining ownership for now." For now. I started to feel like a guest in my own role. Still employed, still salaried, but slowly removed from anything that mattered. My weekly one-on-ones got shorter. My feedback turned vague. Instead of specifics, I got phrases like alignment, energy, and long-term fit. None of that had come up before my diagnosis, not once. At night, I replayed conversations in my head, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. During the day, I overperformed, documented everything, delivered early, followed up in writing. I thought if I stayed professional enough, consistent enough, this weird phase would pass. But there was one moment I can't forget. I was CC'd on an email chain by accident. Just one reply too many. A senior manager asking HR whether this situation needed to be handled sooner rather than later. No names, no diagnosis mentioned, but the timing was exact. The wording clinical, detached. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. That's when it hit me. This wasn't confusion, it was preparation. They weren't waiting to see how I'd perform. They were deciding how cleanly they could remove me. And they were doing it quietly, carefully, in ways that would look reasonable on paper later. I didn't know it yet, but that realization would change how I handled everything that came next. The next few weeks were designed to make me doubt my own instincts. Nothing obvious happened. No dramatic confrontation. No emails saying I was in trouble. Instead, everything became thinner. Conversations lost substance. Decisions happened without me. I was still copied, still invited, still technically there, but my presence no longer mattered. My manager started every check-in the same way. How are you feeling? Not, how's the project? Not any blockers. Just that word, feeling. At first, I answered honestly. Then I noticed something strange. Every time I mentioned treatment, or fatigue, or a doctor's appointment, It was written down. Not literally, but I could feel it being logged somewhere invisible. His tone stayed friendly, but his follow-up questions shifted. Less curiosity, more confirmation. HR scheduled a supportive touchpoint. That was the phrase. Supportive touchpoint. They told me they wanted to make sure expectations were clear on both sides. They reminded me how important reliability was in my role, how leadership required consistent presence. They never said I wasn't meeting expectations, just that the role itself had demands. I asked directly if there were concerns about my performance. They smiled and said no. Then they emailed a recap anyway. I started noticing patterns. Meetings rescheduled last minute, always to times that conflicted with medical appointments I'd already disclosed. When I declined, the meeting happened without me. Notes were posted later, vague, stripped of decisions. When I asked questions, I was told they'd already aligned without me. One afternoon, my access to the internal analytics dashboard disappeared. No warning, no ticket. When I asked IT, they said the request came from management and suggested I speak to my supervisor. He acted surprised, said it must be temporary, said he'd look into it. He never did. Instead, I was asked to focus on documentation. Not strategy, not execution. Documentation. Writing down processes for work I was no longer allowed to touch. At one point, I realized I was being asked to train someone who had quietly taken over my responsibilities. That was the first time I felt anger instead of confusion. I went back through my records, performance reviews, Slack messages, emails. Everything was clean. Too clean. There was no trail of concern before my disclosure. No warnings, no coaching, no measurable decline. But suddenly, there were notes. Casual remarks framed as feedback. Comments about availability, about responsiveness, about bandwidth. They were building something. I stopped venting to friends, stopped assuming goodwill. I started saving everything, calendar changes, access logs, emails with timestamps. I sent follow-ups after every verbal conversation. Polite, neutral, professional. At home, the stress did what the illness couldn't. Sleep got shallow. My phone buzzed at night, and my chest tightened before I even read the message. I felt like I was being erased in real time, piece by piece, while still expected to smile on Zoom. Then came the meeting. HR, my manager, someone from operations I'd never met before. They said the company was evaluating role sustainability. They asked if I'd considered whether this position was still the right fit given my health. They framed it as concern, as flexibility, as options. They floated a reduced scope, a lower impact role, a quiet step sideways that came with a quiet pay cut. I asked if this was optional. They said everything was optional, but the room felt very small. That night, I sat at my desk long after my laptop was closed, staring at the wall, replaying every interaction from the last month. That's when something clicked. Not emotionally, but structurally. This wasn't about me struggling. It was about them managing risk, and I realized something else too. The moment they started documenting me, I needed to start documenting them. There's a moment when fear stops being loud and becomes precise. For me, it happened the morning I realized my work email was being searched more often than it was being answered. I hadn't imagined it. I could see the pattern in the metadata. Delayed replies that came only after HR was looped in. Questions forwarded upward before being acknowledged. Simple clarifications treated like formal statements. Every message I sent felt like it was being evaluated, not read. That's when I stopped asking for reassurance. I booked a consultation with an employment attorney. Not through some dramatic referral, not because I wanted to sue, but because I needed to understand the terrain. He wasn't mysterious or heroic. He was practical. Mid-50s, spoke slowly, asked for timelines, not emotions. He didn't react when I told him the diagnosis. He reacted when I showed him the dates. He laid everything out in plain language. what companies are allowed to do, what they can't do, how retaliation rarely looks like anger. It looks like process, clean, polite, boring, exactly like what I was experiencing. He didn't tell me to fight, he told me to prepare. From this point on, he said, assume every interaction may be read aloud, later. So I changed how I moved. I stopped reacting in real time. I took notes during meetings instead of filling silences. I summarized conversations in follow-up emails. I requested clarification instead of defending myself. When access was removed, I asked who approved it and when. When responsibilities shifted, I asked for confirmation in writing. Nothing confrontational, nothing emotional, just clarity. And the clearer I became, the more uncomfortable they seemed. HR started taking longer to respond. My manager's tone shifted. Still friendly but careful, like someone choosing every word twice. I could tell when emails had been edited by legal before they reached me. The language got heavier, more disclaimers, more as discussed. That was the confirmation I needed. They weren't trying to help me manage my role. They were trying to manage exposure. At the same time, the pressure increased. Deadlines tightened. Expectations became oddly contradictory. I was told to be fully available, but also encouraged to prioritize health. I was asked to lead initiatives without access to the tools required to execute them. It was a trap designed to look reasonable. I didn't fall into it. I tracked everything. Not obsessively, methodically. A private log, dates, names, direct quotes, screenshots saved the right way with headers and timestamps intact, medical documentation stored separately. Clean, organized, boring. That's when they made their move. I was invited to a meeting labeled Role Review. No agenda, just HR, my manager, and someone from finance I'd never interacted with before. They spoke calmly, sympathetically. They said the company was reassessing long-term alignment. They suggested that my position might no longer be sustainable given recent changes. They said they wanted to avoid future misunderstandings. They offered me an exit package framed as generosity, a few weeks severance, extended benefits, a neutral reference. They never said the word diagnosis. They didn't have to. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I asked for time to review the offer. The silence afterward was telling. No follow-ups, no check-ins, just a subtle withdrawal, like they assumed the decision had already been made, that I'd take the deal quietly and disappear. But something had shifted inside me. I wasn't scrambling anymore. I wasn't scared in the same way. I could see the structure now, the timeline, the cause and effect, the paper trail they thought was invisible. They believed they were closing a chapter. What they didn't know was that by the time that meeting ended, I already had everything I needed to open a case. And once I understood that, the fear finally broke, replaced by something much steadier. Chaos doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in through deadlines, tone shifts, and the quiet confidence of people who think the outcome is already decided. 2 days after I asked for time to review the exit offer, my system access was cut again, this time broader, tools I still needed, folders I was actively responsible for. No explanation, no warning, just locked out. When I asked why, HR replied that it was standard during transition discussions. Transition, as if I'd agreed to leave. That's when the pressure turned physical. My phone buzzed constantly. Calendar holds appeared and disappeared. My manager called me twice in one afternoon, both times just to check in, both times asking if I'd had a chance to think about the offer yet. I told him I was reviewing it with counsel. There was a pause, a long one. After that, everything sped up. They sent a revised document, this time with a deadline, 48 hours. The tone shifted from supportive to procedural. They emphasized how the package was above market, how it would be unfortunate if we couldn't resolve things amicably. I didn't respond. Instead, my attorney sent a single email, calm, factual. It outlined a timeline: diagnosis, disclosure, access changes, role erosion, and the offer itself. It didn't accuse. It asked for preservation of records. That's when the silence changed. Meetings were canceled. HR stopped calling. My manager went dark. For 3 days, no one reached out at all. It felt like the calm after a building empties. Not peace, but avoidance. Then the company's legal counsel contacted mine. Depositions were mentioned. Internal review. Clarifying misunderstandings. They hadn't expected resistance. They'd expected exhaustion. What followed was messy in a very controlled way. Document requests, access logs, Slack exports, email headers, their own internal messages pulled through legal channels showed exactly what I'd suspected: concern about precedent, about accommodations becoming permanent, about risk exposure after my disclosure. None of it was cruel. That's what made it worse. It was efficient. My manager was suddenly cooperative again, apologetic. He said decisions had come from above. HR framed everything as unfortunate misalignment. Finance emphasized cost pressures. Everyone distanced themselves just enough. But the story no longer held. As the case moved forward, the offer changed. Then changed again. Numbers increased. Clauses were added. Conditions removed. They wanted confidentiality, speed, closure. I still didn't rush, because the chaos wasn't happening to me anymore. It was happening to them. They'd built a process assuming I would disappear quietly. Instead, they were now explaining that same process to people trained to question it. Every missing justification, every oddly timed note, every temporary decision now had to make sense under scrutiny. And it didn't. By the time a court date was scheduled, the company was no longer confident. They were calculating damage, reputation, cost, internal consequences. They had tried to erase me carefully. What they hadn't prepared for was being forced to explain, line by line, why. The courtroom wasn't dramatic. No gasps, no raised voices, no moment where someone stormed out. Just a quiet room, fluorescent lights, and a judge flipping through a stack of papers that had already decided everything. My attorney didn't start with arguments. He started with dates: when I disclosed my diagnosis, when my access changed, when my responsibilities were reassigned, when HR began documenting concerns that had never existed before. Then he opened the file: side-by-side timelines, internal emails, access logs, calendar removals, a message from legal sent weeks before my exit offer, asking whether accommodations could be time-boxed to avoid long-term obligation. No one denied it. The company's lawyer tried to reframe it as coincidence, as operational necessity, as evolving business needs. But the documents didn't argue. They just existed. And in that silence, the story they'd built collapsed under its own weight. There was a short recess. When everyone came back, the tone had changed. The company asked for a private discussion. 10 minutes later, the settlement offer was on the table. Not the one they'd dangled before, but the one they'd hoped they'd never have to make. Full salary coverage through treatment, extended benefits, a clean separation letter correcting the internal record, and a clause requiring an internal review of the handling of medical disclosures. I didn't negotiate in the room. I let my attorney do it. I just sat there, breathing steadily, realizing my hands weren't shaking anymore. It ended the same way it began, quietly. A few weeks later, the manager who had orchestrated most of it was no longer with the company. Officially, it was a restructuring. Unofficially, people stopped mentioning his name. HR sent a brief, careful email reminding leadership of accommodation policy. No apology came my way. I didn't expect one. What I got instead was peace. My treatment continued without panic about income. I stopped checking my email at night. The tension in my chest faded slowly, like a bruise healing. I didn't tell many people what happened. I didn't post about it. I didn't turn it into a lesson for anyone else. I just moved on. They thought I was gone when they cut me off. I wasn't. I was paying attention, and when it mattered, that was enough.